Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. No prayers, no buffalo speeches, and no spirituality shows. While this podcast does not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do take a tough look at history, oppression, and our survival. We highlight the voices of Native activists, writers, poets, artists, thinkers, and musicians who are fighting for the rights of indigenous people all over Turtle Island. We may step on a few toes through our examination of culture, art, politics, history, and identity. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. In this moment of historical change and social justice, our voices matter now more than ever before. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Say hello and welcome to the program. Hey, I've got a good one here lined up for today. I've got a guest joining me. But before I introduce my guest, let me, I guess, revisit some of the things that we've talked about in the show before. We've talked about decolonization. We've talked about the problem that we have in bringing our culture forward into the future. That's why my topic for title for the show today is Back to Our Future. We don't need to jump in a souped-up DeLorean to recover what we've lost, but we've got to practice it. And when we look at a comparison, a side-by-side comparison to oftentimes parallel or competing political interests as it relates to governance. So we may have a traditional council, a chief's council, versus a band council or a tribal council. Elected councils versus what are considered to be traditional councils. We know that there's a distinct difference between them. Even though, frankly, some of the so-called traditional councils have actually started to emulate and behave themselves much the same way as band councils and tribal councils do, which kind of gets us to the problem, where the problem is at. We don't have a whole lot of utilization of our traditional practices, the clan system, how the skill set that we developed for how we reach consensus and how we resolve conflicts and how we even do day-to-day decision making on our communities, within our communities. So that's part of the problem. So we've adopted this idea or this notion of institutionalizing all of our systems in the way that the United States has, or the way Canada has, or the way Europe has. We look to some sort of institutionalized solution for everything, whether it's parenting issues or child issues, or whether it's crime and justice, as they say, poverty, some of the social justice, some of the mental illnesses, the drug problems we have in our territories. We put police forces together. We build child protective services as an agency within our territories. We do all of these things. And even many of the so-called traditional councils fall into the same thing. Look, every band council, which is how they label the elected councils on the Canadian side, they're all Canadian governments. I mean, they are formed out of the Indian Act of Canada. They are funded. They are, in fact, Canada views these band councils as municipal governments of Canada, part of their system of federalism. On the U.S. side, it's not that different. You had not the Indian Act, but you had the Indian Reorganization Act, the IRA, where many and the vast majority of elected tribal councils operate under the Indian Reorganization Act, which is kind of the municipalization of tribal government. And even many of the governing systems on the U.S. side in Native territories, elected and traditional, that didn't adopt or didn't sign up or enlist in the reorganization under the Indian Reorganization Act, still act the same way. And in fact, what the Indian Reorganization Act did was create a more definitive path for what is a federally recognized tribe. And that definition, as far as the Bureau of Indian Affairs is concerned, is a tribe, band, or nation of Indians subordinate to the laws of the United States. So it's not unlike the Indian Act system on the Canadian side. So we're stuck in this place. Well, let me back that up a little bit. What I will say about the so-called federal recognition process, the vast and overwhelming majority, and I mean like 90% or 95% of all of the so-called tribes that are recognized by the federal government, never necessarily asked for it. They didn't go through a process to where they either agreed to subordination or subjugation to the federal government, where they agreed to be under the jurisdiction of the United States. It just became assumed. And because of our behavior, because of the way our territories allowed themselves to be manipulated by the federal government, we acquiesce into that subordination. Again, I'm not saying everybody. I think there are specific native territories, and there are people within every native territory, U.S. or the Canadian side, either side of that imaginary line, where the people have said, hell no, we're not a part of that. There are people who reject elected councils altogether. There are people who reject band councils. There are people who reject the chiefs' councils that that claim to be traditional governments. Why? Because they aren't following the culture. And speaking as a Mohawk here on Seneca territory, there's no adherence to the Guyana-Lagoa as a broad-based accepted way of governing, where it's not institutionalized, where it is the people, where it's the clans. It's the clan system. In fact, we've heard over and over again where people talk about the chief system. And the chief system never existed in our culture. It was the clan system. The chief system is when white men showed up and said, take me to your leader. And who are the men in charge? And so this whole idea of male patriarchy and male dominance inched its way into our territory, where Native women who were equal in our communities and had very specific responsibilities that the men didn't have. They each had responsibilities that were different from each other. That all went away. And so much so that in many territories that adopted elected systems, women couldn't even vote in those systems. And that was the case here in Seneca territory. When they adopted a constitution, Seneca women couldn't even vote. So they had already lost their standing within the longhouse system, so much so that nobody thought to even give them a vote when it was time. Why? Because white people didn't do that way. So why should Native people do it? And of course, we also get into this battle between the idea of a certain level of religiosity that creeps into our territory. So now we have this rift between Handsome Lake and Great Law, or Gayuyo and Guyana-Lagoa, and that just adds to the problem. So it's not a clear path for us to pull something from the past forward, because we got to go back quite a ways. We have been losing some of that knowledge and that, almost like this muscle, the memory muscle, as they say. If you don't know how to counsel, if you don't know how to reach consensus because you haven't been doing it, it makes it more and more difficult. So I've been asked by a number of people, including my guest that I'll introduce shortly, about this, about how do we dice that up a little bit between tradition and this indoctrination into U.S. style or Canadian style governing systems. And of course, what it comes down to is, well, how do we revisit our basic way of resolving conflict or answering questions or organizing? And by that I mean through the clan system. So let me go ahead and introduce now. Well, I want to introduce Melissa Montour-Lazare, who reached out to me, and what caught my attention was not just to have this conversation about the difference in different governing systems and that kind of thing, but when she mentioned that she was a part of organizing some meetings in Kahnawake, where they were organizing by clan to resolve certain maybe not the big issues, but just to kind of get into that rhythm of utilizing the process of attaining consensus, at least within a clan or several clans. So let me go ahead and introduce Melissa Montour-Lazare. Thank you for joining Let's Talk Native.
Hi, how are you?
Well, I don't know if you've done many radio interviews or podcast interviews or whatever we call this nowadays. So try not to be too nervous. I don't do gotcha questions. We just have a conversation. But you really piqued my interest when you talked about doing some work within your community to bring certain people within your community together to utilize a clan, the clan system. So tell me how you got to that place to even start it, and then we can talk about how it's working.
Okay, so really what I guess pushed me to go this route was I called a women's meeting because there were some issues that had surfaced about sexual assault, sexual violence, molestation. Some stories had come out, and it's hitting the press now locally over here. We got together and we started talking about what were the steps we were going to take, what should be done. And I had asked in the beginning of the meeting if we could sit in clans, because this is the way that we're supposed to conduct ourselves and carry out meetings. And so we had people sit in their clans and we passed the issues one by one. And it was really productive and it was a good feeling. And, as a person who was raised this way, every time I had an issue, like even when I was studying in school, if I had to write something, I would go and I would consult with people of the different clans and I would get their opinions and I would explain to them what I was doing. And I always took everything that I wrote very seriously. And you always see everybody having meetings, right, where the band council's sitting in front of you and you're sitting in the audience and they're like dictating to you how it's going to go. And then we had a shift last year when it came to, I think it was the subject of doing some kind of digging the soil for some testing near the survival school over here. Mm-hmm. And then the Longhouse had a meeting, so we were there. And then from there, we left, and the band council had their meeting at the Knights of Columbus. And when we got there, they were all sitting in a circle. Yeah. And I was like, oh, wow, what are they trying to do, right? So anyway, I left after a few minutes, but I said, okay, well, see, now they're trying to do something here, but it's still not what we're supposed to be doing as a people. So, you see some small progress, but there needs to be a push forward a little bit harder to fit in that clan system. And what came out of the first women's meeting that I called was that there was some people sitting there that just openly said, a little bit shy, like, well, I don't have a clan. And I'm like, you know what? That's okay. You can go to the Longhouse and ask and get adopted and find one, because that's where you're going to get your voice.
Right.
This is what the importance is of the clan system. There's responsibilities that come with that. We're not a matriarchal society. We're a matrilineal people.
Well, and it's not as complicated as, in many ways it may be difficult, but, I know Jacques from Six Nations was trying to really push the Circle Wampum, because the Circle Wampum is that wampum that lists all 49 families of the Haudenosaunee. And that's really what the clan system is. We get confused sometimes because we say bear, wolf, and turtle for Mohawks and for Oneidas, but that's not really the delineation. It is the 49 families of the whole of the entire Confederacy that is what we need to kind of get back to. I'm not saying that we can't get back there, step by step. And I realize that trying to jump off a cliff into what is the unknown for so many people is kind of difficult. But as you mentioned, even whether you're facing a band council or sometimes even Longhouse, Grand Council's been the same thing. It seems like you have this hierarchy in there, and what people miss about the way Grand Council is supposed to work is those decisions are ultimately supposed to have been made in the clans before they ever get formalized in something, like a grand council. But instead, you've had men sitting on one side of the longhouse, and then everybody else on the other side, women in particular, who are again almost sitting in a subordinate position, while the men throw stuff back and forth. If when those men show up at a grand council, they're supposed to have gone there with the decisions that their clans had made. And if they don't agree, then they're supposed to take that back to the clans and say, well, here's what this one said, here's what that one said, can we... And they don't make the decision at Grand Council, but that's not the way it's worked in my entire life. I'm 60 years old, and that's not the way it's worked at all in my lifetime. So we know that we've seen this struggle even amongst those of us who feel strongly about Guyana to Goa, and frankly, even the ones who feel, who follow Handsome Lake. They aren't... Nobody is looking at legitimate processes, and they aren't like these rigid religious institutions. They are really just kind of a natural flow, in much the same way that we deal with things within our own family. I mean, within our own family, we don't really create hierarchies, and except for where we've got abusive households. The men and the women, have an even voice, and that's the way a healthy family is supposed to work. And even children are not supposed to be looked at as possessions or as subordinates. Yes, they need guidance because they don't have the real world experiences. But in a healthy family, you take into account everybody's right to be heard. And we have families that have lost that, and we have entire communities that have lost that, and nations that have lost that.
Right, I agree. And see, that's the thing with us being matrilineal, is we follow the woman's clan that falls through your politics. That's where your voice and your responsibilities come from. The women rear and watch them develop these children. They're the most influential people in their lives, are women. And the reason is so that the male figures look at the women in a respectful manner. It's a reciprocal relationship that our people have. It's love and respect for each other. So that's the most important thing about how our society functions. It's not this paternalistic, patriarchal way of doing things. That's the clash between our cultures right now. The patriarchal system that they came in with a long time ago does not work amongst our people, and their laws do not work amongst our people because those laws are adversarial laws.
Well, and not only do those laws not work, but we never agreed to them. And so when I watch what's going on in Six Nations, for instance, when I hear Doug Ford saying something about rule of law, or that this can't happen or that can't happen, and we hear that on the U.S. side as well. Well, your commitment to rule of law only works if we're all operating under the same law. And since there's nothing in history that demonstrates that we have agreed to that subjugation under your man-made laws, because you seem to defy laws of nature in creating these man-made laws. That's why you had slavery. That's why you have children who were put to work, women who were abused in the workplace and at home. All of the downsides of the societal problems exist most of the time within what is a legal framework, and it's because it's like the words on a paper become more important than the common sense that's supposed to be associated with trying to live a productive and a peaceful life.
That's right. And with their laws, this is the problem our people are facing, because their land system is a feudal system, so it's a constant state of war. Right. Where we don't have that concept amongst our people.
Well, even the idea of land title and the idea of the contracts associated, it's always about how they can take your land if you don't do this, and or you can lose your land for taxes. You can lose your land because you're right. The whole idea of land ownership is about who's going to take it next, and how it transfers in terms of like a personal property, rather than understanding that, for one thing, the land outlives all of us. We are beholden to it; it's not beholden to us. So that whole system is flawed in the first place. And of course, they create this whole notion through the doctrine of Christian discovery that because we were, we didn't believe the same, things that they believed about religion and Christianity, that we were subhuman, and that we were nothing more than the animals that wandered the earth. So they felt like they could claim title because we were like, we just had a right of occupation, which they didn't even recognize that either. But the whole thing is just twisted around a completely different idea and a view of what land ownership was.
I'm really glad that you brought that up because it's important to recognize that our ways is so important, and our people need to keep that strong and alive. You see, our language is getting stronger, and when you talk about religion, in the language they made a word for it, "Gorowiyostu." It's been made to sound real, but our people use "Gatmi Guriyo," the good mind, right? But when they speak, it's like you got to question what they're saying because that same religion is the same religion they use to dispossess our people from our land. When we talk to people or when we speak in general, Oriwio is proven fact. Oriwio is a fact that if you can't maintain peace, you're going to war. And what we see right now in Six Nations is exactly that.
Right. Well, and what happens
they don't
is
grasp that concept.
Because of the way their language becomes force, and when they say rule of law, what they mean is rule of words that they create. And the problem is, we let these words become. We make like you just said, we make them real, even if they weren't real. I remember Stephen Newcomb, who did so much good work on the doctrine of Christian discovery. He once wrote an article that asks us, were we tribes before Europeans showed up? Because tribes is a derogatory word in the first place, and he said, of course we weren't. That's not the way we would ever have viewed ourselves. So we weren't tribes before they came. The question is, how many of us are utilizing that word? How many of us have made that word real because of not just word utilization, but that we've accepted this idea that we are somehow a primitive or a backwards people, which is really what the word tribe and tribal. If you hear that word used any place else, on the news, any place in the newsprint or anything else, when they say the tribal regions of something, they mean the backwards regions, the primitive regions. If they talk about somebody, behaving in a tribal manner, they mean like animals so that word is always negative. And yet when we say, look, we don't like that word, they say, well, it doesn't mean anything bad when we use it on you. Well, if it's something negative every place else, how is it not negative when it's us? It doesn't make any sense.
Right.
So,
well, you know what? Our people, they should never forget. You, each and every one of you, are in charge of this land, and every one of us are responsible to maintain the safety of our land. That's what our people need to remember.
Well, and
every one of us has the right to step up.
Even the words like when we say our land, when we mean that, it's the lands that we occupy, that we live on. So we have the same. Yeah. We have the same kind of responsibility that other living creatures do. But see, everything seems like it's a possession, like a grab, where it's a land grab or a grabbing of consumer goods. So when we try to use English to describe our concepts, they don't always translate well without us having to spend a few extra moments explaining what we're talking about.
Exactly, and that's the importance of the language. And I want to go further and say the importance of the land, because the land is where you cultivate, where you have your agriculture. That is where you get your culture. So if we don't have our land, we can't do our cultural practices.
Well, we can't sustain ourselves, so and that's exactly it, right?
It's impossible. That's it.
Yeah.
So this is where we are. We can't do a lot of things that we used to do, but they have to remember our people used to move around. We weren't always stuck in one spot. And our villages, the way they are today, they're all mixed up in all the different clans, and our clan villages were not like today.
Yeah, we don't build communities. We build residential areas the way white people do. So we don't choose who our neighbors are. Our neighbors aren't necessarily our relatives, like they would be, traditionally. So there's so much that we've adopted in the way from the outside that doesn't work for us culturally. So, when I say back to the future or that back to our future, we have to grab onto some of those things, and not that we don't have to go backwards. We have to bring some of that stuff forward so we think more clearly. Look, there's a lot that's in front of us. We know that there's a lot of potential downside to everything, capitalism, both on the U.S. and Canadian side, globally for that matter. We know that we're seeing failures in their governing systems, in the social unrest. There's so much happening in the world all around us. Racism running rampant, and that's not even talking about the pandemic, the COVID-19 thing. That's just kind of demonstrating it and putting some of this more clearly into focus. But this is where we have an opportunity. If we can look at ourselves and try to become more of a community and understand the relationship, even though, look, we may not have chosen our neighbors, but we should acknowledge each other, and we should look to a future where we bring forward some of that stuff. And look, I'm not just talking about a revolt against band council or tribal council or anything else.
Right, yeah.
But let's face it, if we can recognize where these institutions are failing our people, those are the areas that we should pick up. Look, I mentioned at the top of the show that you guys were taking on some issues that were not the biggest issue. Well, look, if you're taking on things like sexual abuse and molestation, that's a pretty big issue. So I stand corrected on that. I didn't realize that the weightiness of some of the things that you guys took on right from the beginning. But the reason we need to take these things on is because the other systems are failing. They were never designed to really correct the problems.
Right, and those systems were what caused a lot of these problems, because this sexual abuse, sexual violence, this is a cycle that's a learned behavior. So that came from somewhere. I'm not saying it might have never happened before. I'm just saying that it happened a hell of a lot more after they came here with their book.
Well,
right?
the whole idea of subjugation and looking at people as beneath you, that came with their book, with their Bible. And so that's where,
right.
If we had that behavior, and I'm sure, we did have people, look, we had mischievous people, we have mischievous kids, we had people who were not as socially acceptable in various communities, but as a community, we dealt with it. See, now, right. Some of these behaviors are not just learned, but they're systemic. They're part of a belief system. So when we talk about patriarchy and male dominance, that isn't just a learned behavior. That's a intergenerational system that crept into our territories, and frankly, we're battling that from the inside, not just from the outside.
Right. Of course, we're surrounded. It's a bunch of conflicting philosophies. Their philosophy was just that, domination.
Right.
And ours was never that way. So there's a lot of things that came out of just our women coming out saying, this happened to me. These are abuses that have been happening. The first thing the government did was they allowed men in the Indian Act, in Canada anyways, I'm sure, I don't know about states, but they said if a man marries a non-Native woman, that's fine. But if a woman marries out, it's not okay. Do you know how many women I've seen cry that were a Turtle Clan, a Wolf Clan, a Bear Clan, that couldn't come home after their husbands passed away and they wanted to come home from the States or wherever they were living? And I was like, do you realize how much power you have just sitting here talking to me as a Turtle Clan woman? You need to not be afraid to go and speak and be with your clan family and get things going in motion and make that change, because you're still an Ungwe woman.
Right. It
doesn't mean that, you don't belong here and you should never be here. No, that's not it. But what I'm saying is the government has done everything to destroy our people, right from casting out our women to, if we got a degree, you had to be disenfranchised because of your level of education.
Yeah.
And who are they to say who we are? They just created another 2 million people like 2 years ago with their law that they just gave everybody a bank card that had like a great-great-grandmother that was Indian or something, So what's that all about? And, it's good for when they go shopping to get tax exemption, right? But we're not even tax exempt. We're not taxable people. That's right. The point.
That's a significant difference. The idea that we would accept this notion that we were given an exemption rather than asserting that that we weren't taxable in the first place. That's a big difference, and I'm glad that this is a conversation that we're having, because look, we sometimes look at something and we say, well, the net thing is the same thing, we don't pay taxes. No, how you frame it is a big deal. And it's the same thing with things like land and land title and how we treat personal property has become a big thing within our culture now when it wasn't before. And I'm not saying that we didn't have possessions, but we didn't value somebody's stature in a community by all the things that they could accumulate. We valued somebody on how much they could contribute to a community. So how much they could give, not how much they could accumulate. So that whole thing is different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a whole different concept that a lot of people don't really understand, like outside, right? We understand that inside. We all have a responsibility to each other. And your first order of business is your own house. So if your own house is not in order, you have no business in anybody else's house.
Right, and because
that's just the way we...
And because the way the system has worked with capitalism and the accumulation of goods, if you look in most native territories, on either side of that imaginary line, you're going to see most of the line dividing the haves and the have-nots fall along those who work for tribal government or band councils and those who didn't. It's only been in the last couple of decades that private sector development, where people started building businesses and not just leaving their territories to work on the men working on high steel or women going off to find jobs in the city. We started building economies from within. But that legacy of that band council or tribal council mentality being the ones who get all these government funds and the ones who are impoverished are the ones who reject that. So it looks like that somehow being longhouse is like some sort of vow of poverty because how it looks from the outside, and maybe we get duped into that as well.
Yeah, I know it's an unfortunate perception that people have, but it's really, really not like that.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate. There's people that work within the band administration as employees that have work throughout the community, whatever it might be. But the band counselors are the people that are just elected by, maybe 2 to 7% tops of the community.
The Six Nations, they said it was only 4% that vote in band council elections. It's crazy.
Right. So, when you look at the number of employees, which is maybe 1,200 over here, and you look at the amount of voters who turn out, it might be a little bit higher because the families go to support, even though they might not be all with the band council. They'll go there to support, But what was I going to say now about that? The workers are always afraid that if the longhouse takes over, they're not going to have a job no more. That's not what anybody means.
No, and I know exactly what you're saying. So what you end up having is an appearance of there being more support just because of self-preservation and trying to earn an income. Look, a lot of these people who work for band council, and it's real easy for some to throw everybody under a bus, and I get that, and I realize that that's part of a cycle, a downward, a spiraling cycle that's not good. But at some point, and this gets back to what I was saying a while ago, we have got to recognize that if we want to start really peeling this thing back, we've got to start solving some of the problems that are not being adequately addressed by band councils, by elected councils, by their bureaucracies, their agencies, and their committees, and their court systems, their peacekeepers, all that stuff. We, as people, out of our clan systems, should figure out the ways that we can create solutions to some of these problems. And, frankly, you start taking over more and more of those responsibilities from the band council, and you don't have to take them out. They'll implode by themselves. And I'm not saying that that's got to be our ultimate goal, but as we can show a different path forward, it could make a big difference on what the future looks like.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I've been through, I don't know how many meetings with the Longhouse and the band council, and we were talking about, there's a document called the 8 Points of Jurisdiction, right? And they simply just don't want to hear it. And, it was funny, one of the meetings when we sat down in the cookhouse, we were sitting along one part of the table, and the band council just walked in and they sat right across from us. So to me, it was just like the living version of the two-row wampum in ship and canoe, you know? And it seemed like they didn't want to hear, you know, about taxation and all that stuff, because what we're trying to say is that you're engaging in some kind of policy that's going to bring taxation. And we have a thing here, the 1993 agreement, where some people that were in business were kind of forced into a corner and had no choice but to sign this agreement that the Band Council came up with the Quebec government, and just to keep their business. But what happened with that is now people have to submit taxes on the fuel that they sell. You know? So it's not our people's fault, but at the same time, the Band Council needs to step up and say, you know what? We're just administrators here, administering funds and programs that the government has given us, and stop acting like they're the ultimate authority here.
Well, and this becomes a problem with every kind of land deal, every kind of land access deal, because
that's it.
The federal governments on either side of the imaginary line are going to look to these people who they want to tout as having signature authority. I mean, in Oswego, for instance, you had, you know, a bunch of band councilors who took payments for some of these developments that are taking place in the Haldeman tract. So, you know, you've got people who've taken money or accepted a settlement on a pipeline going through, or a highway going through, and they've been manipulated. I mean, here in Seneca Territory, when they put the thruway through the Seneca Territory, it's like $70,000 came to the Seneca Nation, and those pitiful guys on council. They were ill-equipped to stand up to this stuff, and they didn't involve the people because they've been propped up as the leadership. So they got $70,000. Right. In the meantime, the Thruway Authority has made billions of dollars off of a toll road that was never supposed to be a long-term toll road. But it just gives you an example that not only do these guys, get propped up, by giving a certain amount of authority to administer funds, but then that they get manipulated as being the signatories on many really, really bad settlements, that the rest of us are left trying to seek proper redress over.
Well, that's just it. 2 weeks ago or last week, I seen a lady from Ganawage post on Facebook that there was an incident. They went shopping in Saint-Remy, Saint-Isidore, like the town's right next to Ganawage, and they said they weren't taking the bank card anymore. And I said, wow, what a hard face, right in the scenery of Sault Ste. Louis. And our band council did some kind of claim or settlement or whatever, so I posted on Facebook, I want to know what those terms of settlement were. But you know what? They can't probably say all of that because a settlement means there's a gag order attached to that. So
which just lends to its illegitimacy. I mean, that's the whole point, right?
Right? Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's the conflicting part of how we as women are in charge of our territories and our land, and we have no say and no power, and we were not consulted. The traditional people were never consulted. They won't even sit down and talk with our people. They won't come to our house.
Well, and you look at any of these band councils, and the majority of them are all men. I mean, the overwhelming majority of them are men, especially the ones who are the most active and the most arrogant and the most wielding of unjust authority. It's always men, and so it just kind of shows you how bad this thing has gone.
Yeah, right. Well, see, my mom, she got married in 1981. She wasn't even allowed to have land in her name. That was still the rules over here. She couldn't even have land in her name.
Well,
so that only changed.
Even though, things like, and I hate to use words like enrollment, but even though that has never been on the U.S. side, if it's a matrilineal system, it's just the opposite. That a Seneca person or a Seneca man, if he has a child with a white woman, then that child is not, they have no process for bringing that child in, even if they live on territory. So they become just lumps within the community. So, but even though that's been the case, where men couldn't guarantee their offspring would be Senecas, the same thing that you're saying. If you go back in history, it was very rare. You will never find, some of the old tax maps that list women as the owners of property. And even in Tonawanda, which is supposed to be the more traditional Seneca territory, it was always the men who had those handwritten deeds and that kind of stuff. So yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The whole idea of who had rights, even when it's not as blatant as what the Indian Act has done to strip away Native women's, rights. It's the same thing has taken place here on the U.S. side as well.
Well, that's it. It's just a whole bunch of fraud.
Yeah.
Throughout history, everything you read is like, you got to question what you're seeing, because they'll show you, oh, well, we have this treaty. We have 3 chiefs that signed, and there's like a little X. What are you talking about? Nobody would ever in their right mind do anything like that. And on top of that, it's not even for the men or any chiefs to be giving away land.
Right.
So
well,
the whole process, everything.
And it gets worse than that, because I maintain today that if you look at any of the treaties that were ever propped up as legitimate, they were all fraud. The United States never, or Canada, or Great Britain, and none of them. They never entered into treaties that they ever expected to honor. I think they just it was all about lip service. I mean, hell, George Washington. So the Canandaigua Treaty, which was never agreed to by Mohawks and was never actually affirmed by the U.S. Senate, because they weren't even doing any of that stuff at the time. So the Canandaigua Treaty, which is listed as this hallmark or landmark treaty, George Washington has a belt that he has, the Oneidas. He commissions some Oneida wampum maker to make a belt that has the white men being these tall men and Native people being these little tiny guys underneath their power and control. And I've heard Native people, even some of the so-called chiefs or whatever from Onondaga, they will try to promote that George Washington belt as the wampum belt associated with the Canandaigua Treaty, and they completely contradict each other just from a visualization standpoint, and they can't acknowledge the fact that not only is the Washington belt fraud, but frankly, much of the language in the Canandaigua Treaty is fraud as well.
Right. Yeah, and that's like pretty. It happens a lot when you read through a lot of the treaties and a lot of historical documents. There's a lot of conflicting information, and I think when they explained to our people what these documents were or what this meant, I really don't think that they were honest in what they were explaining to our people. Because had they been honest, our people would have never ever agreed to that. Because this is what the effects are right now. What we're seeing, we don't even know how to function as a people anymore.
Well, and again, when you talk about the fraud committed in these documents that our people never would accept, I think about the absurdity of a 99-year lease. Because nobody lives that long. Or at least not long enough to be a responsible adult. I mean, for one, to have entered into that as an adult, and then to be a functioning adult at the end of that 99 years. So you're trying to sell out somebody else's birthright, and that's not the worst of it. In much of the lands that were taken, like from the Haldeman Tract and so many other native territories, but the Haldeman Tract has been in the news lately, those were 999-year leases. I mean, how could there possibly be a legal lease that is essentially 1,000 years? The nations don't exist, for 1,000 years, from Europe and the cradles of civilization. Most of those empires crumble within a couple of hundred years at best. We have a better track record for maintaining, some continuity than any of the European empires ever did. But the idea that we would be duped into a 999-year lease, and immediately those leases would go into default, and we would be in no position to enter into any recourse for evicting people off of our lands. Most of the lands that were taken from us were taken because we stoop, again, our own ignorance, because not understanding the real concepts. We entered into leases where we were supposed to be able to retain the title to that land. And once white people moved in, they said, well, they're there already. We'll work out a settlement, and we'll redefine where your territorial boundaries are. And so it was all based on people who committed outright fraud with the intent to commit fraud. And that's why I say treaties, leases, they were all they were all acts of fraud that never had any integrity behind them, as far as those people who convinced us to enter into those agreements.
Right. Well, here's the irony. It wasn't even their land to give us anyways. It was already existing here where we were occupying and using those lands. So how could you take something from somebody that's not even yours in the first place? That's how stupid it is.
But my point was that they convinced us, and in fact, I heard this whole piece done regarding Six Nations, where many of the so-called leadership from Six Nations thought, well, if we lease the lands that we know as ours to the non-native people, they will never really own it. They'll only be lessees of the land, and they thought, well, that would be a good way for us to create some financial future for us. And so we, our people, and it can't just have been Six Nations. I'm sure this is, something that's repeated itself over and over. So in what, our people were lured into was this idea that, oh yeah, you still own the land, we're just going to use it. And then there was literally have been judges that have said, well, that lease is like a sale. Well, why? Because 999 years, of occupancy, that's what they're saying. Well, if you entered into that lease, you essentially gave that land away. That's literally what judges on the U.S. and Canadian side have said.
Right. So that's why you have to contest the validity of these documents.
Absolutely. Every step along the way. Yeah, every step along the way.
So, I mean, we have so many people that had the opportunity to get an education, go to school, study the law. We have so many women lawyers. We have lawyers. We got doctors. We got all kinds now. We have some pull. So we should sit down. Again, I'm going to go back to saying the women need to get together. I want to hear from my clan mothers. I want to hear from the chiefs. The Longhouse is the only people that have any say in what goes on in our territories, especially regarding our land.
Well, it's the only system that has validity. And that's the whole point. If you're going to use the tools of the oppressor to fight your oppressor, then that's one of these classic metaphors that have been spouted off by people throughout human history. You cannot keep utilizing the flawed tools of oppression to fight oppression. You've got to use something that is legitimate, and we got to make sure that we and that's why I was glad to hear you reach out to me and talk about what you guys are doing there with putting the clan systems back into use. And I'm not saying they've never been used, but they have been used. Yeah. A lot of times the clan systems have been used only for longhouse functions, not in the true governance sense. And I know Kahnawake is a little bit of an exception to that, because it's one of the few places that the longhouse, even when it was run underground by Christian forces, it continued to exist and it continued to function. The biggest question is, how do we get more people in our communities, and especially the younger generation, the ones who haven't been indoctrinated in the same way? Because look, church, military, all those things that have been such a big part of our histories on our territories, those oppressive residential schools, those things were all designed to break us, and to break us in a way that we would never be able to recover. So now we have the opportunity with your generation, younger generations of people to say, look, even though my parents and my grandparents didn't resist everything, they gave me a path forward, and I'm going to utilize that path forward, so we can make the changes that we need to.
That's right. And earlier you mentioned with this pandemic and the COVID-19, everybody's locked in the house. Nobody can go to meetings and congregate, and all these rules they got going on. These are all federal rules that trickle down to the province, to the municipality, to the band council. Right now is a great time for some real reflection about everything that's going on. In our teachings, they talk about a personal condolence, where you clear your ears, your eyes, your throat. That's for your personal self and then your family. If you work on that, then it like ripples out toward the community. And I think people should take this opportunity while they're home with their families to relearn and maybe take this opportunity to learn the things you never got. If you never went to the Longhouse, you know what? We have our clan mother and Uncle Dustin, Louise McDonald. She's been hosting Tea with Mama Bear on the internet, and she had a panel of men 2 weeks ago, and she had a panel of women last week, and they're really, really informative. And last week, I had asked her, I said, could you please tell me what the punishment was for somebody who raped or molested somebody? And she said it. She said the person was taken in a canoe into the middle of the river. They were thrown out. They had to swim to shore, and they had to run a gauntlet. There was 40 men, 20 on each side, each one with a red whip. And this wasn't just done out of nowhere. This is done with words in ceremony, and it's, you know, that's the punishment. So you have to do this 3 times over and over, and you can't whip them above the waist. It's below the waist. So what she said after that, when she explained it to me, and I guess like she caught herself and said, oh my God, imagine if we did that. Imagine if we actually did that. Yes, we might have some human rights complaints and all that stuff, but you know what? It's a cultural practice, so it's allowed.
Right.
But she said, I bet you those numbers would go to 0. Because who actually wants to go through that? I don't.
Well, it's a humiliation.
Sure
it's not only the physical stuff. It's what it has done, you know, to you in the eyes of an entire community. But see, that's what I say. We have to bring back, and I don't care if anybody thinks it's barbaric or anything. The hell with all that stuff. There's nothing more barbaric than watching a cop, you know, kill somebody with their knee on their neck. I mean, so don't tell me about barbarism. So I think we do need to come up with, and look, we live in a different time now. We have better opportunities to communicate. And I'm not saying that we have to abandon something. I'm saying we have more tools in front of us now. As you said, we are more educated. And I don't mean educated like white people. I just mean we are more worldly. We understand what has happened in the history of the world, even though a lot of that history is that is promoted out there is bullshit. We understand more of that history. We understand, again, how manipulated we have been. We understand what genocide is. And, you know, so when we talk about, you know, whether we have doctors or lawyers, we have to have doctors that are prepared to understand some of our remedies and our ways of healing, both physical and mental. And as far as lawyers, we have to have people that are just going to be skilled in Canadian or U.S. law and not even international law. They should understand that we had, as a foundation, we had principles that we have to honor. And, you know, so the idea of even selling land in the way it's done, and the way we've behaved in terms of what leadership and representation means, we have to be very, very clear that that we have. And I almost hate to use the word law, but we have a custom and a tradition that will not allow us to be subordinate to some of these other things that are expected of us.
That's right. So that's why I think it's important for everybody at this time to really reflect and observe what's going on around you, what you're hearing, what you're seeing. And, you know, I think everybody needs to take a minute to think about the approach in which we take to handle our affairs, whether it be the Longhouse, whether it be the Band Council, the government. The government has to stop trying to put a PanIndian solution to everything and only making one door to walk through because it's easier for them. That's the lazy way out. They're not even trying to understand that all our people here are different. We're not the same as out west with the Cree or the Algonquin or the east with the Mi'kmaq. We don't function the same, but they try to make the blanket solution to that Pan-Indian problem with the Pan-Indian solution, and that has to stop. So the government needs to stop being lazy and really try harder to sit with our people and listen, not dictate to us how we're supposed to do things.
Well,
so
and to take that thought a little farther, I mean, you know, I look at how the legal system in the United States works, and it works on this idea of establishing precedent. So what they do is they say, well, if we got a court case that went against Native people in Yankton Sioux, then we can apply that legal opinion against the Haudenosaunee. And said, no, we're completely different people, and the conditions associated with we're not even agreeing with the ruling that happened out in Lakota territory. But if you're going to say that because you had a ruling out there that you can then that would be to suggest that every one of the claims that we make on whether it's a treaty or whatever else, that we all should be able to use everybody else's protections, and they know that they wouldn't go that. Hell, I remember here was a classic example, and again, I'm not a big fan of Canandaigua Treaty, but it's one of those ones that always gets used, right? In Akwesasne, the casino run by the St. Regis tribe got cited for OSHA violations, and they, which is some sort of federal workplace regulations, and they tried to claim that OSHA did not apply to them because of the Canandaigua Treaty. And you know what the judge told the St. Regis tribe? They said that you guys are not part of the Canandaigua Treaty because you're Seven Nations. You're not the Haudenosaunee. You're not the Six Nations. So literally, this group that tries to flout all that stuff got handed it back to them by a federal judge. And I'm not even saying. There's parts of me that agree with it, and then there's other parts of me that say, wow, look at how they turned the tables on us. It's like you spend hundreds of years trying to turn a people into something else, and then you say, well, you can't claim to be those people. You're not those people that you once were. That's this gross manipulation of our people that we've experienced.
Right, that happens on both sides of the line, sure. Right? The imaginary line. Yeah. So what's happening here is this is called a jurocratic democracy. They've bastardized our version of what so-called democracy is supposed to be. And they always do this with jurisprudence. And it really ticks me off because that's the line of work that I'm in, and somebody studying the law, it's really frustrating to have to try to explain this to somebody. And a lawyer especially will say, well, you're under the Indian Act and you have band councils, so that's why they probably said in that ruling that you're not the Haudenosaunee, you are a tribal council because you are a BIA enacted entity, which falls under federal jurisdiction. So that's how they would justify themselves in saying that. But it's still wrong. It's still wrong. But they do that over here all the time. And the teacher I had before, I asked him, I said, why is it like that? How come they don't recognize the Haudenosaunee people? He said, because they can't control you. They do not recognize anything outside of the Indian Act because they cannot control it. And that is why they have the Indian Act. It's not because, the Queen's just being so nice, she's just giving us our own money from our own resources. No, it has to do with control, that domination and control. It's still there.
Melissa, I got to tell you, for somebody who doesn't do this all the time, you've been great to this, great on this program. I appreciate you joining me. I'd love to have you come back. This is for those listening here. We've never even had a conversation, so this is our first conversation. We did it right on the air. So I think there's a lot that you and I could talk about, and I'd love to have you come back and join me again if you're willing. I hope you thought it was a good experience, and look, I hope a lot of people check it out.
Yeah, me too. It was great talking to you. Thank you for having me. And I just want to let everybody know I love you all.
Gonorunkwa.
All right. Have a good night.
All right. Thank you very much. Jake, how much time we got left?
Take care.
All right. Well, I think we timed it just about right. Again, that was Melissa from Kahnawake, and look, this was a great conversation. Hopefully, if you've checked this show out, please share it. Let some other people hear this conversation. I think this is what we need more of. I want to thank you for listening to the program. We went straight through for a full hour. Didn't even take a break at the halfway point like we usually do. So enjoy the program. Share it. Check it out. Perhaps a time or two. So you can take this thing forward. Great conversation. Again, thank you to my guest, and thank you for listening. We'll pick up all of the other stuff on our Tuesday show. So again, thank you for listening. Yahweh.